My name is Michael Casey. I'm a director and partner of a small architectural practice called Caseyfierro, and we share the practice with my partner and wife, Victoria Casey, and also have a number of collaborators who over the years have worked with us. We tend to do small artwork projects, small houses, and we have for a period of time been working with the artist and sculptor Anish Kapoor on a number of projects, notably his studio spaces, which were achieved between 2009 and 15. And this presentation goes some way towards explaining the process of how we design those studios, the importance of the elements within the studios for him, and at the same time, some of the projects we've been looking at afterwards. The site of the studios is in South London. It's in a place which has a number, or over a period of time, had a number of small industrial units within it, interspersed amongst residential areas, and part of the history of the city before 1945 and the bombing, where numbers and fields of social housing and redevelopment have created a rather discordant pattern within the street. However, the place where his studio is, and has been for almost 30 years, since he became highly regarded in his practice, is a collection of a number of buildings along one street. The buildings have been created or bought over a period of time, and they create a campus of studio spaces at the time where he undertook his practice. The one thing about a studio like this, or his studios within this part of London, is that they created a sort of happy accident, because whenever doors were open, there was a glimpse into what was happening internally. We wanted to retain that. That was important, because it's part of the magic about being in a city like London, where you get these happy accidents, you get happy views. It's like being in the centre of town and seeing theatre scenery coming and slotting in and out of a building. It sort of provides a little bit of interest. At the same time, you've got the activity of the building being present on the street, objects being moved in and out of the street. The street itself consisted of 6 buildings. On the far right is a building which was originally a dairy, and beside that, a building that was originally the garages for the dairy. There's a small other separate industrial unit, and beside that, a seesaw structured volume, which was a collection of fabrication buildings for making roller shutters. So you can see from the plan, it's the site itself is a sort of cheese shape, or wedge shaped, but it's defined by having a number of units running north, south, or up and down. The most important thing that we understood was that the process of art creation was not linear. As an architect, you always think you should make linear buildings. You know, in your mind, you think you make a model at one end and out comes a finished product at the other. So therefore, it should be linear, and things should go along a path and end up where they should be at the other end. But what was very prevalent, or what was obvious from working with Anish, was that there was a way of working that required things to go backwards and forwards through that process. You would make something to a certain point, and then you would go back to the beginning again because it wasn't working. You would want to make a significant change that you would want to reflect with other objects, which you would then collect in a room and explore and look at and say, is this part of a path that I'm going on with one particular piece of work? So in other words, this idea about having a linear approach was incorrect. So we ended up in a situation where works would come in and out of the building and pop into each individual unit as and when they needed to be. Now, this is not unusual, because Henry Moore, in his studios out in Perry Green, also had this way. And he was also specific about having barns in that case, where one would have tapestry, one would have maquettes, one would have plaster, and neither of any of these processes would intermix. And that, of course, was important as well, because sometimes They may be making a huge sculpture, 4 meters by whatever, out of steel. And beside that, you'll be polishing a mirror. So you can't have both of these activities happening in one space. So you needed to have separate places. First studio we looked at was the old dairy building. It was a building that was, as mentioned, set within the grain of the city, and it was tough. And one of the first moves we wanted to do was to create a building that had and retained some of that toughness, but also at the same time allowed the inside to be something completely different. And it's a separate activity for what the artist wanted. This is the entrance, the original dairy entrance to the street. Internally, once you went through that, there was a tough structure because of the load of milk tanks, etc. This building could take tremendous load, which was a big plus because the artist's work also can be incredibly heavy. The building consisted of a rude structure, steel, concrete floors, and was layered over 2 floors. So there would be a lower floor and then an upper floor, which we created into a loft studio. But the upper floor was actually a later addition. It was made from an agricultural barn portal frame structure with a light tin roof. So environmentally, it was useless. And in terms of its structure, wonderful in terms of how we could cut it about and reshape it. So one of the first things we looked at was what would be the new architecture internally. How would we deal with it? Well, we were very keen to make something that was of the simplicity of the exterior, but also held us a kit of parts. So where there were existing walls, we'd paint them white. Where there were new walls, we would paint them white as well, but they might be of sheet plasterwork. Where we had bathrooms and WCs, this is all very simple, we would just make sure that they were all located well, and there was a sort of concern about where each position of each object within a very simple room would be. Central to the way we work is with models, and this was the first task we undertook, which was to make a 1:50 model of the overall building, and then figure out where would be a place to apply a double height space, one of the prerequisites of the client's brief. So the nice thing about models, it enables you to explore how light works. You can put the model outside and rotate it to the location of where the sun is, or in real life, and take photographs during the day to see the way light enters the building. These are very crude models, of course, but then you start to explore, well, what if we had the whole volume as one big double height space? What if we had half of it or a third of it? So eventually we ended up in a situation where about a third of that building was made into this vessel internally that was informed by having this large sheet of glass facing north. Facing north was important because it gives an equal light source throughout the day. Important for a sculptor because in order to create things, you need to be clear that one day the light conditions is the same as the next day. When you have direct light, of course, it becomes something theatrical for sculpture because it's informed by the way the shadow casts over the top of it. That, in a way, can be done later when it goes into a gallery space, and whether you have Kunsthalle type lighting, where there's just a field of light, which is always quite successful, or whether you have an American gallery system where you just have spotlights flying all over the place. So what we wanted to repeat was this Kunsthalle approach, which was to have equality of light. And as such, objects could be made and constructed in such a way as you felt confident that this is the way they always look. So from the model, of course, we end up with a space. And again, you can sort of see where we keep the structure, which one saw originally. One's got the concrete floor, which was underfloor heated, because when you get to a certain age, it's nice to have your feet warm, and it's no longer this crude industrial shed where you freeze all day. So it was a place which, in a way, had something of the qualities of a home. An artist, of course, his studio is his home, as well as his home. He lives with his wife and his children, of course. But it's also a place where 8 hours a day, 12 hours a day, he might find himself. And it's a place where he has to immerse in the practice of art so that you move forward with whatever one's doing. So from the upper floor, which we retained, one can look down into the double height space below. And from the upper floor, we also explored how to bring light into that room as well. It was lower, but rather interestingly, the walls on either side before it goes through the crank of the eaves, were about 4 meters high, which is pretty good size, and a size which is quite common within show spaces wherever one is around the world. We were keen to, and this is a photograph of after the model and built the contractor left. We only made very limited interventions on the outside, and they were partly to do with the inside informing where those openings would be on the outside. So in the case of the upper floor, we liked the idea of having a large window onto the street, which you may have seen earlier, and also a small window that looked out onto what is now a pocket park to the north. And that's all. The client later took over the space and used it, and it has been reused in a number of configurations ever since. Sometimes it lays out shows that Anish might be doing. Sometimes it's a place to do painting. Sometimes it's a place just to collect your paperworks and have them all laid out. The window at the end looked out over a playground. That playground you probably saw in the first model photograph. So what about the exterior? So this was a really rude and crude building, and in a way very attractive because of that. So we didn't want to lose something of the quality of that, because it's archaeologically quite interesting to have buildings like this set within the city, and to not try and transform them into something too glam. Where we had interventions, we were very simple about them. We would float sheets of glass over openings where we retain them. We would have windows infilled. We would introduce sheets of glass in the case of the large glazing into the double height space behind. We would have those flush and almost like a light object, a light machine to bring that daylight in. So the fabric of the building became the brickwork and the collage of individual types of brick, and in a way layering the history of the building just with another coat. And from the street, we painted the building black, partly because we wanted to create to signify that it was a different building to the one next door. Partly it was a response to trying to bring together one surface, which in this particular case had a multitude of interventions that were required to strengthen it. As we've discovered, it was into great shape when we started to build. Nice thing about this is, of course, that the building became something that was just in the city, that people passed by and didn't really necessarily understand what was going on behind, which was important because the client wanted to live in a world which was very private. From the north, there was a pocket park made by the local council. So in a way, the building of Anish's studios became the backdrop to that. Having achieved the first studio, it was felt that let's invest in the remainder of the buildings owned and try and do an incremental build so that at no time does work stop, which was an advantage about having a series of buildings all owned by one owner. So the next one we looked at was the old dairies garages. Yeah, they were, before we started, a space full of stored objects, paintings, drawings, works in progress. But of course the building suffered from not being of the best standard when first built, at the same time being environmentally substandard, and it required significant works to make it strengthened again. So it was decided that this building would become a place where one would make form, and that's slightly different because the forms tend to be smaller, and also at the same time they require specific needs, daylight clearly. They also at the same time require extraction for dust, because you do create a bit, and be able to have a multitude of forms being worked on at the same time. So this is one of the 20 collaborators that Anish works with within his studio. And this was also important because he felt that having been with a lot of these collaborators for 20, 30 years or so, it was something that all of them needed to sort of change. They needed to be in a better environment. They needed to, it was a sort of generous work experience for everybody. The upper story, again, we added. Previously there wasn't one, but we added it in the same structure and the same form as that of the studio space. And this became a place for archive. And that building then, the studio next door to the original studio space, then became another sort of house along this street, a house for the making of art. We tried to use the same palette of industrial doors, windows, infilling brick, working with the existing brick throughout the project as we went on to the other stages. The next building was that of an old studio for previous artists, but also at the same time it was a garage. And within that, that's where final finishing of works was undertaken. This was years of gently polishing work, getting rid of imperfections, and it was actually central to his way, I suppose, because this particular type of work is very Anish, and in order to look into a work like this, what comes back at you needs to be perfect. So for that, of course, you need perfect light. You need to have a space without dust, and that's the one thing we thought of first. So we raised the roof up to a volume of 6 meters, installed a new structure at a higher level, and within that structure placed a large continuous glazed roof that provided a daylight throughout the whole volume at a significantly higher lux rate than you would normally expect, because it was pure daylight, and as such provided that brief requirement to be able to see works as you ground them down and to polish them perfectly. One of the guys here just gently polishing the mirror. They may take months doing this. And again, internally, we began to create our own way of intervention. We wanted to work with standard industrial processes of profile metal roofing, super insulated, but also at the same time, we wanted to impose significant beams over each space, because the artist would always want to hang something of 5 tons off the roof and move it anywhere over the space. And at the same time, we wanted to create fields of light, so that when the night time came during the earlier months of, during the early periods in months of winter, then you could balance that with LED lighting at the same time. The buildings also needed to allow access for art movement. So we could open all the doors and allow trucks to enter, pick works up, place it on the back, and take off to wherever they were going. The final studios we looked at were probably the original studios Anish used to have, and they were a collection of individual spaces with the seesaw monitor roofs, and whilst very romantic, they had no insulation. The light wasn't great because it was never even enough, and the one was constrained by the structure because one could never build a piece of work which was above 4 meters. Which, as Anish was beginning to develop, scale was everything. So we looked again at how to transform these buildings. One, first of all, was aware of the street and what to do with the street and how to make the street again informed by what activity happened inside. We looked at a number of arrangements. One was to introduce glazing in a format which reflected the zigzag of the roof, but that of course meant you weren't bringing so much light in from this facade. And then we looked at the idea of repeating something of this monitor roof, or something of this sheet of glass that we had introduced on the other facade of the other building, which is the way we went. This glass was deliberately profilit, which is a glass pane structure, planks of glass. This is the architecture of the 50s, and actually quite nice and very appropriate for a building of the age of the studios as they exist. So we decided to use that typical product again. because it satisfied both technical needs and at the same time satisfied an aesthetic. We're trying to work with the power of the building. The interior, we were very keen once again to lift the volumes and to create space and to create even light on the top to inform whatever's being built underneath or created underneath. This is again a simple model photograph that it told us enough about what we were going to expect. What was important is that the structure of the roof, which we've mentioned previously, should be tough, robust, and in a way was the most detailed part of the exercise. We spent a lot of time calculating the amount of light that was needed, both from daylight and from artificial light, the power of the roof to take loads where they needed to be, the ability for the roof to become a sort of pattern of light, so it had a sort of a slightly domestic feel, but that's the architect talking, and yeah. So again, we created this tool of parts where there were long strips of light evenly spreading throughout the space, long RSJs, beams to take load, and cross beams to take that load back to wall structures where they existed, and clear glaze or translucent glazed roof lights that brought light in during the times of daylight evenly and distributed throughout the space. Another view, in some places we introduced mezzanine floors because the volumes were so high we had the capacity to do that. These are sort of simple renderings that we started on the project on, and how eventually the space, one of the spaces ended up being completed. So we're in a place where we're beginning to create, again, a response to how the interior should be as we marched on through all these incremental builds. So in the beginning, we started off with rooms that were all very white, slightly art orientated. As we moved further into the building, we decided that actually it's probably quite important to retain some of the archaeology of the existing buildings. So wall surfaces were kept, and particularly wall surfaces where the artist may have tattooed the wall with a piece of work or a drawing or a thought written. So these began to be kept as part of the continuing history of the interior. From some of the mezzanines, you would look down into the lower spaces and it would be a place where one would perhaps do paperworks. We tried to make spaces that were incredibly flexible. So one year they would be doing this, another year they may be making something else completely different. And that was important because this art is so prolific. At any moment, as he always says, I reserve the right to change anything I make and any technique I use. So we had to absorb that into our thinking process. So the new spaces, you began to experience what was happening outside from the schoolyard, for instance. Sometimes that was exciting because visitors would sort of see the school on one side, and then on the other side they would see works like this going on, where the interior would make these huge objects that were both surprising, of course, and threatening at the same time. And we were always keen that there would be something of the domestic about it, so that you would get sort of, you would get to see, if you were inside, some of the activity framed in a certain domestic way. These are the sort of the mezzanine spaces at the higher level, and how they informed and looked down onto volumes below. The final spaces were those of for maquettes and for what we call show store. It's the collecting of all of the latest works. The interesting thing about maquettes, of course, is this is how architects work, and so it was very much a way that we used to work with the artist, making constant models and showing models and taking models apart crudely, never making a model that was good enough to not be torn apart. which we rather like because that's a good way of working. It's a quick way of working, but you also inform the way of of the volume you get eventually. So with this artist, working that way was the most fruitful and enjoyable way for an architect. And you can sort of see the models that one's made here, for instance, some of the projects which are ongoing or in the future. This space transforms itself into many uses over periods of the year. The last photograph of what the interior looks like. We continue to work on studios within this practice and around the world. We do a number of investigations. One of our clients was a product designer called Jasper Morrison. We did the interior to his studio in London, which held some of the same ideas about making a studio that was both domestic and working, and held some of the important ideas about bringing light in so you can test works that you've made or maquettes or in this case a table, and just experience what it looks like in real life. On the street, there was one unit that wasn't quite owned by the artist. It was owned by another artist, an artist by the name of Bill Woodrow. And we also, with Bill, who's an old friend, we also looked at filling in his last part so that the whole street was one continuous set of studios, which this project is now ongoing, completed in the future. And again, we kept some of the same interior architecture through these models of what one's seen earlier. We've looked at making spaces in a number of parts of the country for both storing and showing works, and also at the same time looking at developments of how to archive and store works and how that might be, Germans have a good word for it, it's called Schaulager, and show store, in a way trying to see how one could develop a strategy for that. And also looked at working in Italy, how to create a space for art practice and show within a maritime building, and that was quite successful. And, again, a very interesting exercise for the historical reasons, but also at the same time, because one was playing with scale and shape, which we're rather attracted to. At the same time, we've also supported artists in showing works around the world, how one can clean buildings up. In this case, it's a palazzo. And we also, at the same time, continue to work with the artist and look at creating an additional floor onto the estate of complex of art studios as the final part of building on that site. There's nowhere else to go. We've explored transforming agricultural barns within the countryside for works. This had the footprint of an original simple dumb tin shed, and we broke it up and reshaped it, and it provided something of the qualities of some of the spaces we've looked at with the client elsewhere, and continue to support making studios for a number of other artists throughout the world. Thank you.